please welcome Mehran. Hello, Mehran.
Hey, Tom. Good to see you. Yeah, in the flesh. No. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, awesome.
Mehran, you're going to talk about your design system. You've been working a lot with design systems in the past, and this is one of your first talks specifically about this. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's right. So, as you know, I mean, you and I, we've chatted a lot over the years, but, at Mothership for the last few years, we've been building larger sort of complex design systems. And about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we stumbled on Stencil as a way of really energizing what we do, or really enabling a lot of things that were previously not so great. So hence the focus on Stencil. But yeah, I think really the idea is also just to take a step back too. I was hoping to get into the nitty gritty, but I actually rethought that, and I think understanding why using web components is so important and critical is probably more critical. And then of course we'll run through some stuff, some examples, etc. Yeah.
Perfect. I can't wait. So please take it away. Share your screen. I will give you the screen, and then you have your presentation.
Sure. Awesome. Cool. Here we go. All right, so bear with me. I don't know if you can see my screen okay. So hi, everyone. First off, a huge fan of the space, first-time speaker. And I will also just provide a little bit of a caveat here. Like all of us, this is a space that we're learning much about, and I'm really looking forward to the questions as well. I'm sure there'll be a lot of illuminating ideas to kind of expand how we've been thinking about stuff. But I think just to really set the scene, I think what we'll try to explore in the next few minutes is just how design systems that leverage the use of custom web components can really significantly advance, obviously, the workflow of design and product or engineer teams, and really do help move orgs towards this kind of utopian idea of a single source of truth across design and development. And we'll talk a little bit about how this enables that. But the boring title for this really is just how to build framework-agnostic design systems using Stencil, which is an incredible tool to help compile things. Look, we touched on this briefly. I run an advisory. It's actually a design, or a little bit broader, design ops advisory and early stage venture incubator. So we do part early stage funding and also incubating ideas, but then we have a advisory arm of our business that does a lot of operationalization. Oh God damn it, you know what I'm trying to say. We help scale and operationalize design within orgs, and the bread and butter of that is building design systems. And we've been kind of trying to solve problems around this, I think, going on 5 years now. And a lot of what we're exploring here is kind of informing how we've been thinking about things. The other thing that we've been doing, and this is a bit of a shameless plug, but really there's not much yet to plug to, but to provide some context, we've also been thinking about how to help generate design systems. So we're building this tool called Collabor that actually will set you up with a scaffold that we think has all of the foundational pieces that are required to go guns blazing. And so a lot of our thinking is also informed by trying to solve this problem of how do you solution that can be consumed both for prototyping and also for distribution. And at the core of that product is Stencil as compiler. So there's a few things we're going to look at really quickly. And again, I don't think I'm going to do any of this justice, but hopefully it's a conversation starter for some good questions to follow on. But just some macro trends that are informing my own thoughts on this, because I think there's some overarching trends within, specifically impacting design, but also to a degree front-end and UI. And then we'll explore custom web components of stencil.js. And to be honest with you, I'm sure most people listening will be on the technical front more formidable in articulating things, but I'll give it a shot. And then we'll also explore the impact, on an org and workflows really. For a bit of context, also, my background is actually in design. So for, I've been working for a good 15 years, and the first half of that was in lead roles or UX and principal product designer roles. And about 5-6 years ago, when I met Dan Moll and Brad Frost in the States, I kind of fell in love with the idea of coded design. And so I've been kind of tooling up. But you'll notice that when I describe things, I may not adhere to convention. So please forgive me. So I think the biggest of a few trends here is the fact that design is obviously being operationalized and democratized. And what I mean by that is that we're sort of moving away from this culture of creating bespoke design and into the systematic. And that's something that we're all, I think, bought into, given that this is the design system meetup. But also, I think other trends around automating UI and experiences are definitely going to impact how designers operate on teams, and also what their output is going to be. And I think also, again, I'm preaching to the choir here, but there are certain design artifacts that are considered sacred, like going through a, let's face it, we may call it a design sprint, but in actual fact, we're going through a waterfall-esque approach to design, where certain artifacts like wireframes or mock-ups and then static prototypes are created. And I think this sort of emerging world that design systems have begun to initiate will really require us to challenge a lot of these things. Anyway, so that's one trend that I think we need to tap into, and this web components piece really enables. The other thing, and again, speaking to the choir here, but the other macro trend being simply that this idea of a large complex org adopting an official tech stack, particularly on the front end, obviously, is kind of eroding. The squads are being empowered to kind of use stacks that make sense. And so if your design system is bound to a single framework, that's obviously going to create all sorts of issues of adoption. So hence why web components offers a very compelling solution to that. And then the other macro trend, is this idea of moving away from illustrative tools towards tools that can enable designers to output product, essentially. And we'll chat a little bit about how custom web component driven design systems tie into that, but it's a huge, huge, huge thing. So I guess the key question for an org is how to prepare oneself for the imminent sort of arrival of tools that allow designers to move away from Sketch and, dare I even say, Figma. I may get some haters for saying that, or moving away from this idea of two sources of truth model, a symbol library in Sketch or Figma concurrent with a coded repo or a repository for your design system. So I think these tools will enable this kind of, again, nirvana of a single source of truth between designers and developers. And it's happening. I mean, FrameRX being one of them, and Collabor also is about to launch this. And there are a few of these. Interplay is another one that's been exploring this. So just bear that in mind. That's the aspiration here that I think custom web components will greatly enable. Last but not least, or maybe second to last. So again, the emergence of micro front ends, end-to-end ownership for different features or CX goals or categories for different squads. So, how do you come up with a system that allows you to have multiple widgets leveraging perhaps different versions of your design system, or even different frameworks live side by side? And obviously, Stencil and the way that works and the use of custom web components enables that really, really, really well through the encapsulation of styling and a few other things that we'll chat a little bit about when we go through the code. Okay, cool. So let's just go through this. And again, please forgive me if I'm sort of, talking about stuff that's self-evident for this audience. But just in case there are some designers that aren't hardcore engineers, let's go through some of the basics. So really, I mean, a custom web component in a nutshell is a custom HTML tag. So there's a series of APIs that could be leveraged to be able to essentially create your own HTML tags. And so that then allows you to bind to certain attributes or properties, certain data, whether it's a string of data that says, true or false, and that then renders. And so, the most obvious ones of these are different form elements, like a checkbox, etc. Imagine being able to create your own far more complex patterns, right? And generally speaking, or I shouldn't say generally speaking, in actuality, what makes web components incredibly compelling for design systems is the fact that it's adhering to web standards. So you're not trying to go against the browser, you're working with the browser. And now, support for custom elements is profound. So you pretty much have all of the majors covered, and if you still have to support IE10, I'm very sorry, it's unfortunately not there yet. But IE11 and above, for what it's worth, are supported via stencil through polyfills. Another thing I think that again verges into maybe towards the latter part of this, like what's the major benefit to also considering the use of custom web components? And in my opinion, it's this idea of being able to abstract complexity into simple tags. So I might actually just show you for illustrative purposes. You can see this idea of a media card, but then the actual markup for this is far more complex. So this is in stencil. And I should, mind you, tell you that this is a really simple component, right? You can have components that become infinitely more complex. And so what's the point of this? Why am I rambling on about this? Simply put, if you're in an environment where you have multiple squads consuming your components, and you're constantly making changes to this component, what this enables is really a huge reduction in refactoring overhead, right? So you can introduce new props, etc., and on the downstream app or channel that's consuming your component, it may be as little as adding a new attribute to the tag, or it could even involve no changes on there, depending on the sort of stuff that you're making. And of course, that's possible through other ways, but I would argue that this approach is super, super, super simple and seamless, because you do a global import of your resource or your design system output from stencil, which is a JS file, and you are pretty much good to go. You don't have to think about importing, etc., within the context of any component within your parent level application. So I guess the point is, and really what you want in life is something that produces as little overhead as possible for your consumers and within an org, and I think it gives you that. And I should say also, maybe as a prior caveat, whenever I think of these things, it's within the context of massive orgs that have a lot of legacy in place, and sad to say also people, right? So how do you really, really, really make things as stupidly simple as possible, so that you're not going to run into resistance in terms of adoption? So what is stencil? And I'm sure you've, for the most part, heard of stencil.js. Big thing to call out is it's not a framework like Angular or React. But what it is a library that helps you compile custom web components. Now, they do have kind of teased support also for natively compiling into different web frameworks. And you can get access to that, etc. But we primarily use it for creating custom web components for all the other benefits. And yeah, I guess the point is, in terms of what makes stencil so special, and of course you can use lit or Polymer or Angular elements to do similar things. But from a performance perspective, stencil is really unbelievably great. The packages that are distributed are super small, provided that you're adhering to basic hygiene. It's performant out of the box, so your components can be, if we're talking about simple stuff, functional. And of course, given that they're custom web components, your components can be used in any framework, or even no framework at all. And as we were talking about earlier, it kind of allows you to create design systems that are relatively future-proof, because the team behind Stencil is the Ionic team. It's what they use to create the Ionic framework, and they're constantly, not only is it a well-supported community, but they're also constantly thinking about extending it to compile into other frameworks. So as I said earlier, yes, we use it for custom web components, but there is support to be able to compile into various web frameworks, and that support, I think, from discourse in the community around Stencil will continue. So if something does come along in a few years from now, you don't have to start from scratch necessarily. You can continue to compile. Okay, so the other thing that's really cool is a whole bunch of things obviously get baked in with Stencil into your web components. And I think the coolest thing to call out is, well, there's a lot of things, but async rendering or lazy loading is also enabled. So from, again, performance perspective in your DOM or in the DOM, things will only load if they're referenced and called onto the page, which is pretty great. And it uses JSX. So again, love it or hate it, it's something that most are able to quickly figure out, if not have already used it in various kind of scenarios. Now, I'm gonna, from here on in, and I look, a bit of a disclaimer, I had a bit of a pseudo heart attack recently, so I didn't get to finish this in the depth of detail that I wanted to. So we'll flow a bit free falling. Don't worry, I'm fine. And I talk you through a few things while I show you some stuff. So the obvious thing here is that the custom web components can have output and input, right? So you provide the input via the props, which we explored a little earlier. I'm just going to dive into a component as a reference or an example. So you can define, let me find you a much easier component. So you can define these props, and in this case, we're talking about a bunch of strings. And then you can also define events. So, events that are emitted or bubble up from a child to a parent. That obviously is useful for all sorts of reasons, helps you adhere to atomic design principles, or you can have your children speaking to your parents and whatnot. The other thing is that Stencil provides a whole bunch of lifecycle methods to hook into, which is pretty incredible. So you can pretty much construct fairly functional components through these. I mean, the sort of sky is the limit in terms of how complex some of your components can be, notwithstanding obviously being mindful of the need to keep them lean enough. But it's not a bad thing. So I'm going to jump into the project itself. And look, I think I'm going to run out of time to give you a lot of detail anyway, but a few things here. So where are we? The basic anatomy or composition of a Stencil project is fairly straightforward. So you've got your folder of components, which anyone would be relatively familiar with. You have the compiled TypeScript declarations that Stencil generates. So that's the components.d.ts file. You have, of course, your config file, which allows you to define outputs, including also the grouping of components. And there's a whole bunch of other things you can do. But to be honest with you, out of the box, most people won't even have to touch that thing. And then in terms of the actual components, so the basics of a component are fairly, or go as follows. So you obviously define the tag of that component, whatever that is. In this case, this is for a design system for Woolworths, or for the rewards business of Woolworths. So it's RDS for rewards design system. And then you've got your CSS file, which in the case of this design system is importing, as you can see, from another UI framework, some references in the node package, but then also has all of its own custom styling in here. The other thing to call out here is Stencil will, of course, support CSS variables, which can be incredibly powerful, and it can also support the use of themes. So being able to dynamically pass through at the global level a theme that then is reflected via the host pseudo class inside of components. Now, Stencil will generate a README file. This is, I think, important. I'll show you what it looks like in Storybook. So Storybook can integrate quite seamlessly with Stencil. But whatever you define inside of the TSX file as inline comments above any props or events will feed into that. So as you can see here. Then of course, in this case, integrated it with Storybook, so you can do that quite seamlessly. And we also have some unit testing, etc., that's defined in the spec file. I think, let me just jump back into this. And really, I think just to quickly explore implications. So I think the biggest thing that's been relevant to us, so again, the problem that we've had to try and wrangle with for years has been this question of, okay, so now we've built this coded repository, which is great for developers, but how do designers benefit from this? And so this challenge of trying to get designers to use a coded repository, of course, I'm sure you can all relate to, has up until now, I would argue, been insurmountable. And the only solution that's been viable is to, again, maintain a sort of mirror Sketch or Figma symbol library. But what's really incredible about stencils output as custom web components, and also just the prop file, is that you can consume that within Framework-X and other tools. So that means that designers will be able to leverage illustrative tools or GUIs to be able to put together prototypes or even construct components based on child elements. And again, we sort of touched on this earlier, but I think when teams are empowered to be able to essentially deliver as the output of a design sprint changes to your design system, and that those are then published, of course, as components, web components that are abstracted into tags, you can actually have components iterated upon that are already well in flight or being used in production. The benefits of this in and of itself is fairly self-evident. The other thing that's really cool about Stencil, so out of the box, Stencil will, of course, compile various outputs, and you can configure that to arrange itself into various collections that can then be published to NPM as separate packages. And there's a lot to be said just on this topic around what that then means for large orgs, how you sort of govern the maintaining and extending of design systems by empowering different squads to even focus on certain collections, or for them to own, so to speak, certain collections of components. And that, I think, is it really in terms of this piece. So I'll pass it back to you, Dom, if you have any questions.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
We certainly have questions. Can you unshare your screen so we can see you fully?
Sure, of course.
I've got a bunch of questions, actually. Let's start from the top. That was fantastic, first of all. Thank you very much for that. What you said was off the cuff. It felt definitely rehearsed.
No, definitely wasn't. But I guess I've had this conversation enough times over the years. Yeah.
I know the feeling.
Yeah.
All right. The first question is, did I see you use TypeScript? Does web components use TypeScript, and what is that like?
Yeah, so I guess the thing to bear in mind is that the stencil, the template for a web component is done in TypeScript, or JSX. So a lot of the standard conventions that you'd be used to also apply. So if you've built components previously in React, there are a number of those conventions that carry through, but with a caveat. So at times Stencil will do things in a very peculiar, specific way. There's a little bit of a learning curve to make sure you don't cock things up. But yes, that's right. Yeah.
Fair enough. All right. The next question comes from Phil. Hi from Sydney. I'm watching on my phone. Those slides are pretty hard to read. Can you make them available afterwards?
Absolutely. Yeah,
send
no
them
problem
over.
At all.
Send them over, and I will send them on our Twitter around, so you can all get them. Sure. Next question from Mike. Interested how Stencil manages server-side rendering. This is tricky with native components, native web components usually.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We've been trying to explore this most recently at Woolworths. And there, anyway, long story short, there's a product that they have that publishes to partners. So server-side rendering is kind of important to them because it's dealing with patterns that are constantly evolving. And yeah, how to say this? In that particular model, we're actually pushing configured web components, or dare I say markup, onto or into the channels. So you can essentially pull markup from an endpoint that then resolves on the server side. Sorry, on the client side. I don't know if that faithfully answers it. And to be honest with you, yeah, a bit of a gap in my own skill set beyond that particular application. But I will say again, like given how light these components are, and essentially what you're doing on a web component is toggling props. That approach that I just mentioned is pretty lean and pretty versatile. Yeah.
Awesome. Another question from Alex: what does styling look like with Stencil?
Yeah. Okay. So I might actually show you that. So the thing about Stencil is, out of the box, it's incredibly flexible. You can decide to leverage whatever approach you wish to leverage. In our case, sorry, the way that we've been doing it is, yeah, we've been using CSS variables or SAS variables depending on the client, and obviously within the component themselves, you can pretty much put whatever the hell you want to put in here, and it plays friendly. I might just show you the output if that's what you're referring to. Alex, one sec. So we were chatting a little bit about will this get me into trouble showing you client stuff? We'll see. But let me just load you, components. The other thing that I actually just really want to emphasize is Storybook integration. Like we might actually publish how we've done it. It's a thing of beauty with Stencil. Yeah, I don't know, Alex, if that answers your question. Hopefully it does. But it's flexible. It's super flexible. It can work how you want to work it. We, for what it's worth, tend to leverage UI frameworks because oftentimes when you go into a place, there's a bit of legacy there or an attachment to something. So we might use that as a starting point. Yeah.
That's all right. You didn't share your screen there at that point, so we didn't see anything.
Shit. Look, it wasn't that important anyway, unless you want me to share it. Yeah.
No, that's all right. Yeah. Let's go on to the next question from Miko. How have you found getting an established engineering team to adopt web components or Stencil, especially if they got a stack they've been working with for years?
Yeah, I think this is like the most common series of conversations we have. So to be honest with you, it takes time. And typically what will happen on an engagement is that we'll quickly develop a POC. Obviously, we'll have some conversations with leads or lead engineers to kind of explore what's currently there, but we'll put together a POC that allows them to see how Stencil components are also consumed, allows them to see what degree of flexibility they have within the parent level application that's consuming those components. But by and large, the big questions around performance, that's typically answered quite nicely because, as I said, the performance, honestly, as far as JS frameworks are concerned, the outputted Stencil components perform unbelievably well. Like anyway, I wish I had shown you some sort of a chart, but they're quite incredible. But yeah, I think it's like anything. There is a little bit of hesitation typically within larger orgs, but once they begin to see the benefits, and I think the primary benefit being really the fact that it's framework agnostic. So the fact that different squads using different frameworks can consume verbatim the same thing and have it render the same way is quite compelling. And then I think the next thing, of course, that greatly assists is how to empower squads to be able to contribute themselves. So again, maybe I'm veering off the question, but I think if your governance model is one that actually promotes input on the part of different squads to contribute new components or iterations to existing components. That tends to help, because I think the biggest fear is this perception that they lose control to some extent. Yeah.
Great answer. Thank you. And then the last question from Alad. Questions with regards to governance. How do you think Web Components or Stencil compares to normal package management in JavaScript?
Yeah, to be honest with you, the approach, there is no major difference. I will say that out of the box, how Stencil compiles and some of the options you have for the creation of collections, etc., is fairly decent. So again, it all depends on the model you choose to adopt. But if you're choosing a model where you're abstracting your design system from a consumption point of view into multiple packages, you can do that out of the box. So you can create, whether you want to map that to atomic kind of design level constructs, you can put together your cores, your elements, your components, and then patterns or collections of patterns. But it's not unlike what you would be able to do elsewhere. It's just that some of that has already been done for you, or this like grouping or into different collections comes out of the box. That makes sense. And of course, it integrates with NPM, publishes to NPM. Yeah, like you would otherwise.
Awesome. Mehran, thank you so much for this.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me. Really, real pleasure. Yeah.
I appreciate it. We do the handshake.
Yes, let's do that.
All right.
I don't know if that's going to work.
I think that worked.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate everything you guys do.
And
really
hopefully we'll see you in person soon when the virus all comes down and all the other crazy things.
Sounds good. Beautiful. Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye.